12 fleets entered the Earth system. After 43 minutes, there was not a single one left. Not because humans were stronger, not because their weapons were more powerful, but because when Earth finally decided to respond, it didn't fight like a civilization defending itself. She fought as a species with nothing left to lose. And what happened next silenced the entire galaxy for 300 years. If you want to know what happened the day humanity let go, don't switch channels, because this isn't a story about victory. This is a story about what happens when you corner a creature that has survived its own extinction 7 times and come back even angrier each time. Watch to the end. You won't forget this day. It didn't start with war. It started with silence. 300 years before the morning the fleets entered the system, humanity encountered its first alien civilization, the Katir, a species of traitors with cold eyes and even colder calculations. Initial contact was polite, an exchange of technology, diplomacy, cautious smiles on both sides. But behind Katir's politeness hid a truth that humans wouldn't know for another 20 years. The galaxy operated by rules Earth had never agreed to subscribe to. Rules where the strong species took the resources of the weak, where new civilizations, lacking a navy, were automatically considered accessible. The Earth was young. The Earth was alone. The Earth was, by the standards of the galaxy, defenseless. And this is where the real story begins. Captain Elena Sokolova stood on the bridge of Gagarin Station, watching as sensors recorded 12 enormous shapes emerging from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system. Her hands didn't tremble. Her heart beat steadily, because she knew something their enemies didn't. The Earth has been waiting for this day for 20 years. 20 years ago, after a coalition of 7 alien species, calling themselves a Conclave of Expansion, sent the first ultimatum demanding that Earth open up its resources for fair distribution, humanity did what it has always done best in its history. It didn't give up, and it didn't show that it was scared. Earth's diplomats smiled during negotiations. They agreed to gradual cooperation. They asked for time. But while the human representatives were stalling at the negotiating table, something happened that the Conclave could never have foreseen. They underestimated how quickly a species that had spent its entire history killing each other in wars could learn to kill effectively when the enemy was finally shared. The Earth did not build a fleet to match the enemy. Earth was building a fleet to destroy the very idea that anyone would dare come again. General Marcus Chun, the man who had lost his wife in the bombing of a colony on Mars 10 years earlier, the Conclave's first show of force to remind them of their negotiating position, stood in a command bunker deep beneath the Earth's surface. The screen before him displayed 12 enemy fleets, each outnumbering the entire human combat force. The young officer next to him, Lieutenant Sanchez, couldn't hide the fear in his voice. "Sir, there are too many of them. We can't even see the edge of their formation." Chun didn't look away from the screen. His voice was calm, like the calm before a storm. "They came expecting to see fear, Lieutenant. Don't give it to them." He turned to his team, and what he said next would go down in history as one of the most famous speeches ever given before a battle. "They've been studying us for 20 years. They think they know who we are. They've seen our negotiations, our concessions, our apparent weakness. They didn't see what happened underground, in the dark, far from their sensors. Today, they'll learn the truth about humanity. We're not a species that asks for permission to survive." The Conclave fleet, led by Admiral Kresta of the Drellic species, a chitinous, triple-jawed race renowned for its brutal efficiency in suppressing fledgling civilizations, approached Earth with the lazy confidence of a predator that knows its prey is cornered. Krest sent a standard, all-frequency message, one the Conclave had used hundreds of times before, conquering dozens of worlds. "Earth, your time for diplomacy is over. Lay down your arms. Open your defenses. Resistance will be considered a declaration of war, and the consequences will be irreversible." On the bridge of Earth's flagship, named the Phoenix after the mythical bird that rises from the ashes, Earth Unified Command President David Odieno turned on the return broadcast. He showed no fear. He showed no anger. He showed something that made even the seasoned Admiral Krest freeze for a moment. He showed calmness. "You call us a young civilization," Odieno said, his voice echoing throughout the Conclave ships. "You're right. By galactic standards, we're infants. But let me tell you something about human infants you haven't read about in your intelligence reports. We are a species that killed its own gods when decided it deserved a better explanation for existence. We are a species that threw off the chains of slavery it created. We are a species that fought 2 world wars that cost the lives of 100 million people, and still decided that life was worth living. We have buried billions of our own people throughout history, and each time rebuilt, stronger than before. You think we are afraid of death because we are young. You are mistaken. We fear death less than any species you have ever conquered, because we have seen more of it than any of you. Silence fell upon the Conclave ships. Some of the officers watching the broadcast, creatures from species that had conquered civilizations for millennia, sensed something they hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. But Admiral Crest merely grinned with his triple jaws. Beautiful words. Human. Let's see if you'll be as eloquent when your cities are reduced to ashes. He gave the order to attack. And here begins a moment that will change the history of the galaxy forever. The first wave of Conclave ships, some 200 Drellix-class battlecruisers, rushed toward Earth orbit, expecting to encounter the typical resistance of a young civilization, scattered defensive platforms, weak weaponry, and panic retreat maneuvers. Instead, the space in front of them simply disappeared, not in a figurative sense, in the most literal sense. Earth spent 20 years developing a technology unknown in any Conclave intelligence report, gravitational field distortion technology capable of creating localized space-time anomalies. Earth scientists, working in utter secrecy at secret bases on the far side of the moon, dubbed this technology simply Horizon. 200 Drellix ships, traveling at near-light speeds, were met with sudden gravity wall, an invisible trap that instantly tore their ships apart at the molecular level. There was no explosion. There was no dramatic fireball, as they so often show in holographic recordings of wars. There was only silence, and where a second ago there had been 200 ships, the elite vanguard of the Conclave, there was now only a cloud of dust, slowly expanding into the void of space. A deathly silence fell on the bridge of Cress's flagship. "It's impossible," whispered one of the navigator officers. "Warping technology on this scale requires energy beyond anything we've ever seen from a young civilization." Cress clenched his jaw. "Continue the attack. Immediately, direct the remaining fleets along different vectors, avoiding direct lines of approach." But it was already too late, because while the Conclave was trying to figure out what had happened, General Chun and his team were already putting into action the second phase of a plan that humanity had been developing for not 20, but actually 40 years. A plan that began long before first contact, a plan that only 5 people on the entire planet knew about. The plan was simply called Prometheus. You see, humanity didn't learn of the existence of a galactic civilization at first contact. It learned of it 70 years earlier, when one of the first radio telescopes accidentally intercepted a fragment of an encrypted Conclave transmission flying past the solar system during one of their expansionist campaigns. In a neighboring sector, the government of Earth, instead of panicking or announcing the discovery to the entire world, did what humanity did best when faced with an existential threat. They were silent, and they prepared. 70 years of secret preparation. 70 years of secret research programs disguised as civilian projects. 70 years of uniting all the world's intelligence agencies for one goal, the survival of the species. And when first contact finally occurred and the Conclave arrived with an ultimatum to discover resources, humanity already knew the most important thing. Sooner or later, they would have to fight. The only question was when and how. Dr. Amara Featured, the lead physicist of the Prometheus project, stood in the control center of a secret base on the far side of the moon when the battle began. Her team had been working without sleep for 3 days, preparing to activate the system they have been developing for 2 decades. "The Horizon systems are functioning normally," one of the engineers reported, "but the energy reserves are depleting faster than expected. We only have time for 1 full activation cycle." Amara nodded, her face tense but determined. "Then we use this cycle where it will make the most difference." In Earth orbit, Admiral Crest finally received an alarming report from a reconnaissance ship sent to investigate the mysterious technology that had destroyed his vanguard. "Admiral, we've detected the source of the anomaly. It's not a weapon in the traditional sense. It's an artificial gravitational lens created by a network of orbiting satellites. It's capable of creating localized ruptures in space. Crest felt a chill run through his chitinous skin, a sensation he hadn't felt in centuries. How long will it take to destroy these satellites? We aren't certain, Admiral. Their defense systems surpass anything we've seen in other young civilizations. It was at that moment that Crest realized what he should have realized 20 years ago, when the Conclave first encountered the polite smiles of human diplomats. The Earth was never weak. The Earth simply waited. But it was too late to change strategy. The 11 remaining fleets were already moving toward the planet, and retreating now would mean disgrace before the entire Conclave, a disgrace no Drellics could afford. Continue the offensive, Crest ordered, though every cell in his body screamed the opposite. Split the fleets. Attack from as many vectors as possible simultaneously. Don't let their technology concentrate on one point. It was a tactically correct decision, but it was also exactly what humanity had been waiting for. Because Horizon technology had one major flaw, known only to Earth's top commanders. It required an incredible amount of energy, and it could only be activated a limited number of times before it required a lengthy recharge. That's why the first demonstration wasn't aimed at killing as many enemies as possible, but at something much more important, to create fear, and to buy time. As the Conclave fleet split, attempting to avoid the second gravity trap, deep within the Earth, launch silos began to open at secret military bases scattered from Siberia to the Sahara Desert, hidden beneath layers of earth, camouflage, and deception for decades. A project known only as Legion. You see, humanity understood something no other species in the galaxy had. To defeat an enemy that outnumbers you, it's not enough to have superior technology. You need a philosophy of war that the enemy can't predict. And the philosophy of the Earth was simple and terrifying at the same time. Every human warship was piloted not only by a human crew, but also by artificial intelligence trained on data collected throughout the history of human warfare. This wasn't meant to replace human judgment, but to enhance humanity's best and worst trait, the ability to make impossible decisions when there seems to be no good way out. Captain Sokolova, aboard Gagarin Station, watched as the first Drellics fleet closed in for close combat. Her finger hovered over the activation console. All systems ready, she said calmly. Remember the protocol. We're not fighting to win today. We're fighting to ensure the enemy never wants a return. And then the real battle began. Not the elegant ballet of high-tech ships exchanging laser blasts, as depicted in entertaining holograms, but a brutal, desperate, merciless battle between a species that has held back for too long. The first strike was carried out by a squadron of Valkyrie-class fighters, small, fast ships flown by the finest pilots in humanity, hand-picked and trained for a decade specifically for this moment. Major Yuki Tanaka, commander of Valkyrie 7, led her squad straight into the center of the Drellics formation, where logic would dictate staying away. Tanaka, you're flying straight into their firing zone, the controller shouted over the radio. Exactly, she replied, her voice calm despite the mortal risk of the maneuver. They don't expect us to fight close. They're used enemies who keep their distance, afraid of death. We won't keep our distance. The Valkyrie fighters slammed into the heart of the enemy formation, maneuvering so close to impact that the Drellics' AI, accustomed to calculating enemy trajectories from a safe distance, couldn't adapt. It was a tactic born of the darkest and most brilliant aspect of human nature, the willingness to risk everything, including one's own life, if it meant inflicting maximum damage on the enemy. The Drellics, a species that had conquered 17 civilizations in their history, had never encountered an opponent willing to fight as if death were no object. Not because they did not value life, but because they valued the survival of the species more than their own survival. Yuki Tanaka lost 3 ships of her squadron in the first 10 minutes of battle. But in those same 10 minutes, she destroyed 15 enemy fighters and damaged 2 large cruisers, opening a gap in the Drellics' defenses through which the main Earth forces rushed. On the bridge of the Phoenix, President Odiano watched the battle unfold with a face that expressed not triumph, but a heavy, measured awareness of the price humanity was paying for every minute of resistance. How much have we lost? He asked quietly. The adjutant next to him hesitated. Sir, we're losing ships faster than expected. Valkyrie 7 has lost half its complement. Orion Defense Station has been silent for 5 minutes. Odiano closed his eyes for a moment. Every loss was a name, a face, a family waiting for news. But then he opened his eyes, and the resolve in them didn't waver. Continue. We didn't start this war, but we will end it in such a way that no one else will dare start another. It was at this moment that Admiral Kress received a report that made him finally realize the true extent of the Conclave's mistake. Admiral, we've intercepted a transmission from a secret human frequency. These appear to be activation coordinates for something enormous, located on the far side of their satellite. Kress frowned, his many eyes narrowing. What coordinates? We're not sure, Admiral, but the energy readings, they exceed anything we recorded before. This doesn't look like a defensive structure. Kress felt something inside him, something ancient and instinctive, inherited from millions of years of species evolution as a predator. Cry out in danger. We're retreating, he said suddenly. The officer next to him froze in amazement. Admiral? We never retreated. The Conclave never. I said retreat. Kress barked, and for the first time in his long military career, there was undisguised fear in his voice. This species, they don't fight to win. They fight to destroy the very possibility of our return. I've only seen that look once before in my life, on a cornered predator who's decided he'll die, but he'll take everyone around him with him. But the order came a few minutes later than it should have, because deep on the far side of the moon, Dr. Amara Fayed and her team have made the final preparations to activate a system that took humanity more than 40 years to develop and cost the lives of hundreds of scientists in accidents at secret facilities that will never be revealed to the public. A system that humanity has simply named Terminus. It wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. Terminus was Earth's last line of defense. A system capable of creating a temporal distortion of space-time on such a scale that could literally rip an entire fleet out of the normal flow of time, sending it into a vicious cycle with no escape. Not death, something far more frightening. Eternity trapped in a moment repeating itself endlessly. Amara stood before the activation console, her hands shaking not from fear, but from the gravity of the decision she was about to make. Are we confident in this decision? She asked quietly of General Chun, whose image appeared on a holographic communication screen. General Chun was silent for a long moment before answering. Dr. Fayed, do you remember why we built Terminus? To protect the Earth. No, Chun said, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who had borne the weight of impossible decisions for too long. We built it so that we'll never have a reason to use it again. So that one demonstration of what humanity is capable of when cornered will forever discourage any civilization in the galaxy from ever testing us again. He looked straight into the camera. Activate Terminus. Amara took a deep breath and placed her hand on the console. What happened next will be described differently by observers on both sides of conflict for the rest of their lives. The space around the 8 remaining Conclave fleets, still attempting to organize a retreat, suddenly began to distort, not explode, not disintegrate in the conventional sense of physical destruction, to distort like a reflection in water disturbed by a stone. Beyond the fleets, the stars began to move irregularly, slowly at first, then increasingly quickly, as if time itself were beginning to spiral around a specific point in space. The crews of enemy ships, observing this phenomenon through their viewports and sensors, sensed something no known language in the galaxy could describe, a horror so pure and primal that it surpassed even the fear of death, because what was happening before them wasn't the end. It was something infinitely worse, a distortion of the very fabric of reality, creating a pocket of space-time that closed in on itself. Admiral Kress, observing the events from a flagship bridge, attempted to issue a final order for an emergency jump to hyperspace, but it was too late. 8 fleets, consisting of over 1,000 warships and nearly 200,000 living beings of various conclave species, simply disappeared from normal space-time. Not dead, not destroyed in the usual sense of the word. Simply outside, Earth scientists observing the effects of the Terminus's activation detected something inexplicable, a faint, barely perceptible gravitational signature left behind at the point where 8 enemy fleets had been just a second ago. The signature persisted, pulsing with regularity reminiscent of a heartbeat, as if something out there in the folds of space-time still existed trapped in an endless loop of the final moment before disappearance. No one on Earth will ever fully know what happened to the crews of those 8 fleets. Did they still exist somewhere, trapped in a time loop, reliving the same moment of horror over and over again for all eternity? Or was it something more merciful, simple annihilation disguised as something far more terrifying? Dr. Amara Fide never slept peacefully after that day, knowing she had activated a weapon whose consequences no human mind could fully comprehend. But the 3 remaining Conclave fleets, watching 80% of their forces disappear in a matter of seconds, made a decision that would forever change the history of relations between Earth and the rest of the galaxy. They ran. They didn't retreat in a tactical manner. They didn't organize a controlled withdrawal of forces. They fled in pure, undisguised panic. A type of panic that the Drellic species, which had conquered 17 civilizations and never known defeat in its 5,000-year history, had never experienced before. Admiral Crest, watching his own flagship activate an emergency jump to hyperspace without his direct orders, because even his own crew had lost control in the face of absolute horror, spoke words that would later be translated into hundreds of languages across the galaxy and come to symbolize the day the galaxy learned the true nature of humanity. We came to conquer children, but we found monsters hiding under the mask of politeness. As the last Conclave ship vanished into hyperspace, silence fell over Earth. Not a peaceful, calm silence, but the heavy, deafening silence of people who had just experienced a moment that would determine the fate of their species for centuries to come. On the bridge of the Phoenix, President Odiano slowly sank into his chair, allowing himself to show the true weight of his experience for the first time in the long hours of battle. "How many have we lost?" he asked quietly. The adjutant's voice trembled as he answered, 12,347, sir. Military and civilian casualties on orbital stations. Odiano closed his eyes. 12,347 names that will never be forgotten, but whose price will forever be weighed against the price humanity would have paid had the Conclave prevailed that day. And the enemy? 11 fleets were completely destroyed, sir. One escaped in an unknown direction. A long silence hung on the bridge. Broadcast all channels. Odiano finally said, "An open message to the entire known galaxy." Within minutes, the message, broadcast on all known galactic frequencies, had reached every corner of known space, including the capital cities of every major civilization, which was watching the outcome of the conflict from a distant, safe distance. "We are Earth," Odiano began, his voice calm, but every word carrying the weight of absolute determination. 20 years ago, the Conclave of Expansion came to us demanding submission. We agreed to negotiate not because we feared you, but because we hoped that a civilization calling itself advanced would understand the language of diplomacy better than the language of force. We were wrong. Today, 12 fleets entered our system with the intent to enslave our species. 11 of them no longer exist. We do not boast of this victory. We mourn every life lost on both sides in a conflict that should never have happened. But let this be a lesson to the entire galaxy. Humanity is not a young, defenseless civilization awaiting conquest. We are a species that has survived near annihilation countless times in our history, from plagues that wiped out a third of the continent's populations to wars that nearly wiped us from the face of our own planet. Each time we have returned. Each time we have grown stronger. We don't want war with the galaxy. We want a peace built on mutual respect, not subjugation. But if anyone else thinks humanity is easy prey, remember this day. Remember what happened to the fleets that came to take our freedom. Never again will the Earth be a silent victim of alien ambitions. The message spread across the known galaxy within hours, translated into hundreds of languages by the various species observing the conflict. Both the message and the battle itself had the same effect as the creators of the Prometheus project had envisioned 40 years earlier. Absolute, stunning silence. Not a single civilization in the known galaxy dared to directly attack Earth for the next 300 years. Not because humanity had become the galaxy's dominant military force. It remained a relatively small civilization compared to the ancient empires that had existed for millennia. Because every species that learned of the Battle of Earth learned the lesson that Admiral Crest learned at the cost of the near-total destruction of his fleet. Humanity is a species that, when cornered, will not behave rationally in the conventional sense. Humanity will fight, as if the survival of the species is more important than the survival of its individual members. Humanity will use technologies as terrifying as necessary to ensure the enemy never dares to attack again. And most importantly, humanity will never forget and never forgive the attempt to enslave it. But the story didn't end there. Because 3 months after the battle, when Earth was still recovering from its losses and actively rebuilding its defenses in case of the possible return of the Conclave with a larger force, something happened that no one in human command expected. A lone ship appeared at the edge of the solar system. Not a warship, but a small diplomatic vessel, flying a flag of truce recognizable throughout the galaxy. It was not Crest or any other military commander of the Conclave who was on board. On board was the Drellic Supreme Matriarch, Zeskala, ruler of an entire civilization, who had personally arrived on Earth for the first time in her species' 5,000-year history to meet not with military commander, but with President Odeano himself. When her small ship docked with Gagarin Station, Captain Sokolova, still bearing the scars from the battle 3 months earlier, personally greeted her guest, prepared for any treachery. But Zeskala, a being ancient and wise who had seen the fall and rise of dozens of civilizations during her incredibly long life, bowed her head before Captain Sokolova, a gesture that in Drellic's culture meant an admission of absolute, undeniable defeat. "I have not come to apologize for the actions of my kind," she said in the broken but understandable human language she had learned specifically for this meeting. "I have come to understand." President Odeano received her personally in the main negotiating chamber on Earth, the same chamber where the Conclave first delivered its ultimatum 20 years ago. "Understand what?" he asked. Zeskala was silent for a long moment, her many eyes studying the face of the man before her, as if trying to solve the puzzle that had puzzled her civilization for millennia. "We've conquered 17 civilizations in our history," she said finally. "Each one, faced with superior force, either surrendered or fought and died trying to protect what little they had. We understand this type of resistance. We respect it, even as we conquer. But what Earth did, it wasn't resistance. It was..." She paused, searching for the right word. "It was a warning, a demonstration of what your species is capable of when it decides it's willing to do anything to ensure a threat never returns. We have never encountered a species willing to use a weapon so horrific in its consequences, knowing the full cost of that decision, simply to send a message to the rest of the galaxy." Odeano was silent for a long time before answering. "You're right," he said finally. "Terminus was our last line of defense, a weapon we hope never to use. But when you came to demand our enslavement, you left us no choice between a good decision and a bad one. You left us a choice between a terrible decision and the complete annihilation of our species. We made a terrible choice because humanity, throughout its history, has chosen survival again and again, no matter the price that had to be paid for that survival." Zeskala nodded slowly, as if finally understanding something fundamental about the nature of the species her civilization had encountered. "Then let me propose not capitulation, but something else," she said. "Peace. Real peace, based on the recognition that humanity must never be treated as easy prey again." The treaty signed that day between Earth and the Drellic's Conclave was the first agreement in the history of the galaxy, concluded not between a victor and a vanquished in the traditional sense, but between two civilizations that recognize each other as equals, not in military might, but in their determination to survive at any cost. But the real legacy of that day was not a diplomatic agreement. It was a story that would spread across the galaxy, passed down through generations of different species for the next 300 years. A story of a young civilization that, faced with annihilation, did not choose surrender, did not choose a heroic but doomed struggle. She chose to become a monster for one day, so that she would never have to become one again. General Chun, who lived to a ripe old age, often told his grandchildren the story of that day, always ending with the same words, which became the unofficial motto of humanity among the stars. We didn't want war. We never wanted it. But when the galaxy decided we were too young, too weak, too defenseless to deserve respect, we showed them that a species youth doesn't mean it lacks the depth of its determination to survive. 12 fleets entered the Earth system that day, hoping to find easy prey. They found a species willing to pay any price for the right to determine its own destiny. And the galaxy never forgot that lesson again. Because sometimes the most terrifying enemy you can face among the stars isn't the most technologically advanced civilization, the most numerous army, or even the most destructive weapon. Sometimes the worst enemy is a species that has been patient for too long, held back for too long, and finally decided to show the world what happens when patience runs out. The Earth was silent for 20 years, but when she finally spoke, the entire galaxy fell silent in response. And this silence lasted for 300 years.